All right.
Mhm.
We have been going through the book of Revelation. We have been plugging along, taking it chapter by chapter. And the title has been called End of the World or Cause for Hope. And as I remind us every week at the beginning, I believe that this book is a cause for hope. And that's going to come up in a big way in this lesson today.
Hmm.
Class 13, I've entitled it The Answer to the Beasts. Last lesson, we considered Revelation 13, where we read of two beasts that were summoned by the dragon. There's a stand in symbol for Satan, evil personified in grandiose scale. And these two beasts are physical representations of the Roman Empire in all of its greed, violence, and false promises. The beast from the sea, specifically representing Rome's imperial army and military strength, and the beast from the land, representing the economic practices and ways of Rome. And when we left off at the end of chapter 13, the two beasts were in ascendancy, requiring homage, praise, and the beast's mark from the people of the earth. And as we progress through chapter 14, I think we'll find that it serves as chapter 13's inverse reflection, not perfectly, but in broad strokes. Because in chapter 13, we read of the ways the beast held the people of the earth in thrall. And in chapter 14, we read of those who did not accommodate the ways of the beast and the blessings they receive as a result of their faithfulness. So, where we're going tonight is we'll be considering chapter 14 with a mind to how the words contained therein may bolster the confidence, faith, and courage of those faithful saints who resist the death dealing ways of the dragon and his beasts. And of course, we'll be unpacking the symbolism behind these word pictures along the way. So, let's dive right in. Revelation 14, verse 1, and it reads, Then I looked, and there was the Lamb standing on Mount Zion, and with him were 144,000 who had his name on his father's, who had his name, who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads. So here, if you were with us two weeks ago in our last lesson, after many chapters describing the nature of evil, starting really in chapter 12 and moving on through 13, as manifest first by the dragon, then more recently by the beast, which symbolizes Rome, the narration takes a leap forward. We are now back in the throne room of God where we began. Remember, it described in chapter 4, but now the heavenly hosts have reason to rejoice. And we are about to see a vision in miniature of what will be fleshed out more fully in chapters 21 through 22. So here, after the blowing of the seven trumpets and after what happened with the 12 and 13, chapters 12 and 13, now we have chapter 14 where we're going to get a glimpse into where we are headed, where all of this is headed. So it's a little glimpse into the future of the book. Now, a few words stand out. Mount Zion is a site that was resembled or symbolized salvation. Quoting from the biblical commentator Roland, who wrote the New Interpreter's Bible Commentary, the picture of Zion as a site of salvation is familiar enough from the Old Testament, Isaiah chapter 2, Micah 4, though Jerusalem is elsewhere in Revelation depicted as a place of rebellion. We've already seen some of that. But judging by the context, the theme of salvation seems to be emphasized. Here you have this picture of stained glass, of course, dramatized, but of the Lamb triumphant on the holy mountain with streams of living water flowing. That's more Revelation 21, 22 territory, but we'll get there. Also, the name of God is written on their foreheads, the Father's name written on their foreheads. I will also say this is the only place where Jesus, the Lamb, is where the Father or where God is directly referenced as the Father in Revelation. Happens all through the Gospels. It's just an interesting note. I'm not even sure what the significance is. I just thought that was interesting how we have in this verse the only time where God is given a title of parent over the Lamb, Jesus. That aside, they have a mark on their forehead, and the mark of the faithful witnesses is to be contrasted with the mark of the beast, as mentioned in Revelation 13. One shows fealty to the beast, the other to God. And Thompson writes, I remember it's from Leonard Thompson's commentary on Revelation. I forgot to cite the source, but he writes, throughout Revelation, the forehead is a favorite place to make a mark on the body to indicate one's fidelity and ownership. And it lists a couple of places in Revelation where that is the case. Verse 2. And I heard a voice from heaven, like the sound of many waters, and like the sound of loud thunder. The voice I heard was like the sound of harpists playing on their harps. And they sing a new song before the throne and before the four living creatures and before the elders. No one could learn that song except the 144,000 who have been redeemed from the earth. Now, this sound, this cacophony of noise from waters, this has been an analogy used before, waters cascading to symbolize a voice, meant to describe a heavenly voice that is as grand in scale as the crashing of many oceans. But here we have it combined with the beauty of music. Also, the themes of waters contained and channeled as a voice communicates that this messenger has command over chaotic and uncertain forces. Other places in Revelation, we've noticed moments where waters were contained, or even waters that were tumultuous were channeled in life-giving ways. And here we have another place where the forces of heaven are able to control the uncertainty and the chaos. You also have new song written here, and this is a phrase that comes up in Psalm 33, probably most famously. But it has precedence in the Hebrew Bible. And of this, Brian Blunt writes, the fact that it is a new song further clarifies its message. In the Old Testament, the new song establishes a theme of ransom or protection and adds it to a corresponding assurance that God will rightly judge those who have persecuted God's witnesses. In Psalm 144, the new song sung on a 10-stringed harp. So here you have the theme of harp revisited, another instance of themes from the Hebrew Bible getting pulled into Revelation. So sung on a 10-string harp is changed in celebration of the one who gives victory to kings and rescues faithful servants like David. The theme of justice pervades the singing of new songs at Psalm 33, verse 3, or 96, verse 1. I won't list them all here. In all likelihood, we are meant to know that the heavenly multitude is singing the song in a cacophony of chorus, and those redeemed on the earth are capable of learning the song, something that not even John claims to be able to do, at least not yet. It is as if they have been tuned to the frequency of heaven and are now in step with God's purposes for humanity and all creation. Now they may join in the harmony. And here I wrote Silmarillion, which is a reference to Tolkien's book that he wrote after Lord of the Rings, but is about the creation of that earth. And in that, I find a great a story that illustrates what I think could bring to light this new song and this idea that the 44,000 can learn this. It doesn't say they have learned it yet, by the way, but they now can learn the song that is sung in heaven and join in the harmony. And that reminds me of, in that book, the Silmarillion, there was discord in heaven. They were making music. And there was one named Melkor, who was the dragon figure in that story, who strikes a discord, and it makes all of the music sound off balance. And so the creator, God, adds a new note to it to create a new harmony, more complex, and wove the discord into the harmony, and was able to therefore redeem the discord. And as things progress, you discover that more and more are able to join in the song, and then others are able to be acclimated into the song, and then some others are so hell-bent on disharmony that there's no assimilation. And so here we have the saints mentioned back in chapter 6 who have been sealed and kept and protected, and now they are introduced into the song, which would indicate that they have been so transformed that they can understand and hear the melodies of heaven. Metaphor, all metaphor, but that's the gist. Yeah, but it goes on, and this this, I don't know if this threw some of you, but if you really think about this, it's problematic on face until you understand its reference to the history of Israel. Verse 4, it is these are the ones who are the 144,000 who have not defiled themselves with women, for they are virgins. These follow the Lamb wherever he goes. They have been redeemed from humankind as first fruits for God and the Lamb, and in their mouth no lie was found. They are blameless. So Okay, first off, let's deal with this. Not defiled themselves, as if uh, interchange and interaction with women would defile. And of course, it means sleeping with women, and specifically says that virgins are the ones that are, upright. So all men, virginity required in heaven, what gives? Well, it's a metaphor for holy war. Because the writers of the Old Testament considered sexuality to be such a powerful force, they instructed that it be ritually insulated from normal life. So that persons engaged in special occupations or missions, such as the priesthood or guards army, during the time of their service, refrained from sex, not from a moralistic standpoint, for moralistic reasons, but to insulate the sacred service from other powers. It's actually a common practice in other armies in history, where the soldiers will take vows of commitment to one another, and also sometimes vows of celibacy, and you've probably read similar stories in the Bible. And it's pulling us back to that time where people might be readying themselves for battle. And in this case, it is removing distraction. And so it's using age-old stories from Samuel, from Deuteronomy, where the people were instructed into these ways, to call them back to a time where the people were set aside and committed for the good fight, the fight against the forces of evil. And so this is not literal. I would say that in modern times, we should find we would prefer a better metaphors. But in the time of this book's writing, the first century, this would have been like so many others. You would have probably had a relative that had fought in a war where this may have been a similar practice. And so that's the point. And what is described here is not unlike instructions given to Hebrew soldiers in the above referenced passages. The point of such practices was to ensure, I've already said these things. So here, the 144,000 are compared to a fighting force for good, unwavering in their devotion. Here, the practices of a focused fighting force are used as a metaphor to describe the singular devotion to Christ's faithful witness, as represented by the 144,000 saints. This is not to imply that virginity is a requirement for heaven or that women will be excluded. For Pete's sake, I don't think many people actually take that line that seriously, but that is not what is being communicated here. Moving on, then I saw, which in the Greek is kai edon. I should have probably explained this earlier, but whenever you see then I saw in Revelation, it is almost always a translation of this kai edon, which marks a transition, a scene change. And the scene change may include stuff, pictures that have continuity with what came before, or it might feel like a complete non sequitur. I just bring it up so that next time you're reading through and you notice that then I saw, if what comes next doesn't seem to flow with what came before, that's because we're having a scene change. And in the whole, the book all fits together, but sometimes it can be a bit jarring. And so here we have another one of those moments. Then I saw another angel flying in mid-heaven. That's the sky. The upper heaven is heaven. Below is, Hades, Sheol, the abode of the dead. Mid-heaven, it's the sky. So another angel flying in mid-heaven with an eternal gospel to proclaim to those who live on the earth, to every nation and tribe and language and people. He said in a loud voice, "Fear God and give him glory, for the hour of his judgment has come, and worship him who made heaven and earth, the sea and the springs of water." So on the line that includes every nation and tribe and language and people, here is the gospel proclaimed to everyone on the earth. This is good news for those who are ready to hear it, those whose ears may yet attune to the heavenly new song mentioned in verse 2. But after what we read previously, in chapters 12 and 13, this may seem a lost cause. After all, wasn't the dragon given control over the earth? And aren't his beasts loose and causing havoc? The point is, from the vantage point of John's audience, it may not have seemed plausible that those around them, many wholly committed to the Roman enterprise of command and conquest, would ever turn and respond positively to the good news this first angel brings. What is received as good news by the saints and those who have faithfully witnessed to the Lordship of Christ is received as judgment by those who cannot hear heaven's song. The hour of God's judgment has begun. So it's good news or bad news, depending on where you sit. And whether or not, from John's vantage point and to John's original audience, bad news for those who had colluded with the Roman Empire for their own benefit and promotion, and as opposed to resisting and not failing to accommodate the Roman Empire. Now there's a second angel, then another angel, a second, followed, saying, Babylon, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has made all nations drink the wine of the wrath of her prostitution. So by now, if you've listened to previous lessons, you probably understand that Babylon is a metaphor for Rome. Here, the second angel foretells the fall of Rome in the past tense. Just as Babylon had pulled surrounding peoples under sway of its rule, so too has Rome made all nations drink the wine of the wrath of her prostitution. Prostitution, I'm now realizing, is another theme from the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, that I should have spent more time talking about here. Because what I'm wanting to say here is that there were many women pushed into prostitution for no reason that they chose. But even back then, their vocation, if you will, had become a metaphor for debauchery and evil living. And I'm wanting to say, having known some prostitutes forced into that kind of work, I'm wanting to find a better metaphor. But in the Hebrew Bible, it constitutes unfaithfulness to the realm of God. And in this case, it's in fealty to the Roman Empire and all of its violence, greed, and the problems that it carried with it. So the point carries, and I also feel like I need to say that. Perhaps I should have said a little more about that. There's grapes on this vine. Moving on. The grapes on drink the wine of the wrath of her prostitution, alluding to grapes on the vine, and they had long served as a metaphor for prosperity in the life of Israel and the surrounding peoples. Grapes pressed into wine, symbolized the fruition of life's goodness, the culmination of all that gives one satisfaction in life. But the wine Babylon/Rome offers is defiled and deadly. Those that drank it will have to wake up from its influence. Moving on. Then another angel, a third, followed them, crying with a loud voice, those who worship the beast in its image and receive the brand on their foreheads or on their hands, they will also drink the wine of God's wrath, poured unmixed into the cup of his anger, and they will be tormented with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever. There is no rest day or night for those who worship the beast in its image and for anyone who receives the brand of its name. Now, before I dive into what's next, I'll say that images trying to describe God's judgment and anger at the evil in this world, the ones used by in the Bible times and before, and even up until fairly recently, we've been fairly comfortable with metaphors of war and violence, because much of the world, as was known back then, was inundated in that. Now, I would argue that we are also inundated in violence, but we have come to prefer other metaphors. And so what I'm hoping here as we move forward through this, that with all of the talk of fire and brimstone, fire and sulfur, and God's wrath, you can understand that this was written to a community, and from their vantage point, they had been centuries of abuse. The people alive then, in their middle ages or older, raising their children, would have experienced decades of abuse and violence and stressful living. And so one can imagine the sort of bloodlust that might be satisfied in a community like that. The main point, though, is not to emphasize the bloodlust and the destruction, but to emphasize God's stalwart determination to do justice, to bring justice, and to also set it to the tone of how angry God is when the innocent are oppressed and the vulnerable are put under. Okay, it's probably not even satisfactory for what's coming next. But that being said, there are ways of approaching this that help me along. Those who accommodate Rome to get along, or even to prosper, they will drink the wine of Rome's own making. We referenced wine earlier, and how they can be seen that rhyme to be the symbol of that that nation's the toxicity within those people. And these bear the symbolic mark of Rome's ownership over their lives. These marked by the beast are to be contrasted with those marked by God. And these marks are symbolic of the markings or the fruits, the actions, the deeds, the witness that indicate one's true allegiance. So here are two images taken from the Hebrew Bible: wine poured out in judgment and fire and sulfur, that are used for the same reason. The reference to wine is a callback to the book of Habakkuk, where we read, "Alas, for you who make your neighbors drink, pouring out your wrath until they are drunk, in order to gaze on their nakedness. You will be sated with contempt instead of glory. Drink you yourself and stagger. The cup in the Lord's right hand will come around to you, and shame will come upon your glory." It's a similar metaphor used, hundreds of years ago. And indeed, in Jeremiah 51, Babylon itself is described as a golden cup in the Lord's hand, used to punish nations. So this is a more grandiose way of saying both at once. And again, I wish we had a better word picture here. But the point is, you reap what you sow, and those that live by this sword die by the sword. Or in this case, you made the ingredients for this wrathful wine by way of your idolatry, violence, and greed. Now you must drink it. It's a bed of their own making. And if you've read up to this point, you've seen multiple avenues and opportunities and overtures for people to turn away from the death-dealing ways of empire. And this is assuming that as much that could be done has been done to turn the card around with the human race. More of this in verse 9. Actually, more on those same two passages, two verses 9 and 10. As for fire and sulfur, the meaning is similar. Fire and sulfur is a reference to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Jesus referenced in Matthew 25, verse 41. Also, you can read about it in Genesis 19, the sin of which those two cities was inhospitality and abuse to God's servants. And this smoke seems to serve a dual purpose here, the smoke that goes up. Note that the bowls mixing and pouring happens in the heavenly courtroom. So if we're imagining this happening in the pit mentioned in verse 12, no, this is happening in the presence of the holy angels, in the presence of the Lamb. So now I'm reminded of another bowl mixed with incense, with smoke that rose up, the smell of the prayers of the saints combined with incense that we read about back in chapter 8. And it was a pleasant experience for those in heaven with God. But those who have chosen the short-sighted vision of the dragon, who chose separation from God in exchange for temporal safety and lies, and the lies that Rome could offer, now that smoke rises from heaven, which was pleasant to the saints, but torturous to those who have worked against God's purposes for us, some of which are life, love, goodness, and peace. And when I was at seminary, we talk a lot about ways to see this with a theology of life and hope. And one of the ideas that was postulated that I think is compelling, although I just think it's the best we can do to try to harmonize our own sense of justice and kindness and love with some of what we read here. But it could be that the fires of the prayers of the saints and the love contained therein and all that they symbolize, their hopes, their passionate cries that are heard and then reacted to by the heavens. It could be that those very same, I say scent again as a symbol or a metaphor, not they're up in heaven smelling the smoke with real noses. It's all, again, to paint a picture for us. But what would be pleasant and lovely to them might be torturous to one who had rejected love. Meaning, if you've ever known somebody who what they seemed to hate about you was the compassion you brought into the room, which I have met people like that. You could see someone in this circumstance experiencing the fire of God, the light of God, and all that others might see as beauty. They might experience it as the polar opposite, and it would be their perspective that gave them gave rise to hell. That's in the weeds, but I think it acknowledges that Some of this imagery is troubling and redemptive, and a mixture of both. We have to name both. Now, as I referenced earlier in Revelation 8, verse 5, it was an angel who poured out a cup of wrath onto the earth. Now, God takes full ownership of the situation by taking judgment into God's own hands. God created the world, so God is about to clean it up. In the middle of this are two verses that are, I think, put here to remind us of what this entire book is about. Verse 12, here is a call for the endurance of the saints, those who keep the commandments of God and hold fast to the faith of Jesus. And then verse 13, and I heard a voice from heaven saying, write this, blessed are the dead, who from now on die in the Lord. Yes, says the Spirit, they will rest from their labors, for their deeds follow them. Second, verse 13 reminds me of other passages in the epistles where the writer would try to ensure the churches, those who had died, had not been lost. There had been, in the first decades after Jesus left, a belief that Jesus was coming before that generation died. You can find passages of the Bible that allude to this belief. And, well, when people started to die, people had anxiety. And so here is one in that theme where John the Revelator is telling the church on earth that even those who have gone on before, who you have lost to the ways of the Roman Empire, they are not gone, and God has kept them, and they have not died in the most meaningful sense. But then verse 12 really is Revelation in a nutshell. It's at the heart of Revelation's call and purpose. Revelation painted the first and second century Christians a picture of their circumstance and all of its trials and tribulations. And in it, John wrote truthfully of the dire situation at hand, and the way it seemed as though evil and power seemed forever intertwined, as embodied in their day by the Roman Empire. But a time is coming when good wins out. In the meantime, don't accommodate or compromise even to save your life, for God will keep the saints even through death. This revelation is the overall main purpose of John's apocalypse. Verse 12. Now we're going to two last word pictures, and this will conclude fairly quickly. We'll read these all in lump sum. Then I looked, and there was a white cloud, and seated on the cloud was one like the Son of Man, with a golden crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. Another angel came out of the temple, calling with a loud voice to the one who sat on the cloud, use your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, because the harvest of the earth is fully ripe. So the one who sat on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was reaped. Here is an illustration that should require less explanation for those familiar with the parables of Jesus or even the older Hebrew writings. Themes of reaping and harvest repeat again and again, as they were so relatable to the cultures in that time, and they're still relatable today. Harvest implies a fullness of time. And in the context of these writings, we are meant to understand that forces for evil will have limits and will not persist forever. That's what it means for the harvest to be on the horizon. Here, the meaning of harvest can be understood in a similar way to the meaning behind the numbers 7 and 12. Both indicate completeness, and when used in the context of time, the fullness of time. And the harvest, likewise, marks the completion of a life cycle. So now the divine farmer, God, knows that it is time to make a clean sweep of the earth, but with a careful detail to cull and gather the life in the field. Those familiar with the role of a harvester in their cycle could understand that they had a vested and intense interest in saving as much good grain as possible. This is not a reaping meant to cut good life low. This is a reaping meant to save life nearly choked out by the weeds, or the trials and tribulations, as we've been reading about. Also note that the separating of the wheat from the chaff is not directly mentioned. Some have wondered if this does not allude to a universal salvation. There's not enough here to go that far. I like the idea. I'm partial to it. I also think that you could just as well assume that this could lead to a universal damnation. It doesn't really say, it just says the harvest has come and then the fields are harvested. It doesn't really say what the fate is of the grain, although I think the context clues and life meaning what it does, and fruit on the vine and grain in the field in other parts of the Bible, I think it's a safe assumption to say that those who are, again, harvested could be a troubling metaphor if you're thinking about the cutting down of grain, but if you think of it as the reclamation of life for the sustenance of the community, well, then it serves very well. And the main point of this is to say, a time is coming when all of the fruit of the earth, which means the deeds of humanity and those attached to it, will all be reaped. And if those other places where this metaphor is used to talk about the separating of the wheat or the chaff, you could, I guess, assume that would also be something that would happen here. But it's not mentioned directly. I just note to you. And then, lastly, the chapter concludes. Then another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. Then another angel came out from the altar, the angel who has authority over fire, and he called with a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, "Use your sharp sickle to gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, for its grapes are ripe." So the angel swung his sickle over the earth and gathered the vintage of the earth, and he threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city. The blood flowed from the winepress as high as the horse's bridle for a distance of about 1,600 stadia. There is a scholarly consensus that the 14th through 20th verses of Revelation 14 are directly linked to Joel 13:12, where we read, "Put in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Go in, tread, for the winepress is full. The vats overflow, for their wickedness is great." And it shouldn't be hard to see why biblical commentators think that that's in part the inspiration for this and where your mind should go when you read of this, which would connect you to other parts in the Bible where grapes are mentioned and wine is used as metaphor. It should inform our interpretation here. And the grapes in this sense represent the fruit of the dragon's efforts to corrupt the earth. That's why John Steinbeck's novel, Grapes of Wrath, that's why in this reference from Joel, it is the vats are overflowing with the wickedness of the people. So grapes in this sense represent the fruit of the dragon's efforts. And now all who serve the dragon and his beasts will taste the fruits of their labors. These fruits are rotten, and when condensed down to wine is a powerfully toxic mix that will not go down well. And here I was thinking today, as I was reflecting on this, what would the wine pressed from the grapes of wrath, plucked off the vine in 2024 look like? And I was picturing throwing all of humanity's hatreds and greeds in atomic bombs and all of the all that gives rise to suffering. And I hope that by God's grace we can circumvent a time where we do begin to taste the fruits of our own labors. So much attention, moving on to the blood talk, much attention has been spent on the sheer volume of blood described here and later in chapter 19. The volume of blood described here is unbelievable, for it would cover a total of 180 square miles. Again, as with much else in Revelation, here is not a literal description of something we should expect to happen in history as described. Again, emphasis on word pictures here. But once we take into account that John is tapping into an age-old metaphor, we can flesh out the rest to understand what all this blood means. Simply put, commentators note that 1600 is the square of 10, signifying totality, multiplied by the square of 4, which signifies the 4 corners of the earth. Now, that John intends us to read it in this way is not certain, but either way, the point stands, and the point being the judgment affects the whole world. It is wide, it is broad, and it extends to the 4 corners of the earth. As Fiorenza Susler writes, the desperate cry for justice by the slaughtered saints of chapter 6, verses 9 through 11 has been definitively answered. And the answer is in totality. In other words, the wine that has been pressed from the suffering of humanity, it will be dealt with in its entirety. The suffering, all that goes with it. So, rough chapter, and here's some final thoughts. In chapter 13, John's apocalypse uses images of bizarre beasts to give expression to the evils that surround him and his community. These beasts symbolize the brutality of a government that and an economic system that had taken control of the life of those within its sway and had made life challenging for those who were unwilling to accommodate the empire's demands. This included the worship of and complete loyalty to the emperor and his vision for the world. In many ways, chapter 14 is an answer to chapters 12 through 13. In chapter 14, we are reminded that the time for evil and suffering is finite. It will not continue forever. God is just and over all. God will bring suffering to an end and in the reaping, save all that can be saved from a world that seems at once hell-bent and heaven-bound. In the meantime, those whose fruits are wrathful will find their own weapons used against them. I mean to offer no details here, and I don't think we can know how God will judge and bring justice to the human race. But John's revelation wants us to know that what the dragon and his beast symbolize will not ultimately win out. Next class, we'll begin Revelation's descent and then ascent to its finish. Between now and this letter's end, we'll read the final cycle of 7 plagues represented by bowls, the judgment of all, and of a new heavens and a new earth. We'll move on to time of questions or comments. I just like to leave my references here so that if somebody wants to pause and take note, they can later when they watch this video. And also, before we move on, we're not having class next week. We'll have class again on March 20th. Next week, we have a leadership council meeting, but we will be covering chapters 15 through 16 and the bowls of wrath. Now I will bring us up to stop sharing my screen here. And somebody is, oh, there's Janet here. And you asked that you unmute yourselves, and there was a lot in this. It was dense and it wasn't exactly fluid. So what caught your attention? What's on your mind?
Well, I made a note when you were talking in verse 8.
Okay.
Let's see. Where was it? Let's see. Because all the nations were drunk in the wine of fortification. And my footnote, you were looking for another way to describe it.
Mm-hmm.
And my footnote said it was organized rebellion.
Organized? Well,
does that say what you want to say?
Well, I could look up the original. The commentaries that I read translated it as prostitution, which probably suggests that's what the original Greek did. Now, it was using prostitution as a metaphor to describe that very kind of rebellion. So it sounds like your Bible translators did what I was trying to voice, which is a desire to find another way of saying the same thing.
Yeah, yeah.
Not out of a I don't know, a tepidness to talk about prostitutes, but just because, in the Bible, there's a reason why so many of those prostitutes come out well, and it's because Jesus was helping us transition into a time where we would see that it's not so simple and cut and dry as prostitutes, terrible women, period, and so, but I appreciate that though, that does get at it, but I'm about to look it up.
And I guess when I think of prostitution, I never remember which one it is. It is Hosea that went to marry the prostitute. I can never remember which one it is. Anyway.
I think that's right.
And then, she goes back to her old ways and he takes her back, he buys her back everything, and eventually she stays. So, there's the
and you could see that as a metaphor, but then when you think about this woman who's sort of being drug along as an illustration, married, it's problematic. But
it just shows God's love for Israel, and no matter how many times they sinned, that he took. That is the point.
That is the point.
Yeah.
That is the point. That is. So you said this says wrath for fornication is what the King James Version says, and that's a translation of porneia, from which we get the word pornography, illicit sexual intercourse. So yeah, that's what it means in the original, but again used as metaphorically here. That's still, yeah. You won't hear me using it in a sermon.
I didn't expect to, nor do I expect to hear about the blood. It's hard to.
I actually have a different take on that than many people who are eschew blood talk. Sorry, I interrupted you. finish what you were saying.
No, I'm coughing. Go ahead.
Well, the idea that I do find troubling, the idea that somebody had to die, like almost in a math, like almost in terms of mechanics, like there had to be like a counterbalance to the evil, and so somebody innocent had to suffer. And that is not the only way you have to read the crucifixion of Christ. It is the way most obvious in the Gospel of John. It is not the way that the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke see it. Yes, I think I can stand behind that. But the idea that God, embodied in a human form, would bleed for someone, not because it expunged anything, but because in the name of love, you would sacrifice your life's energy in that visceral way to the very end. That's compelling to me. So when I sing of the blood of Jesus, I'm thinking of those things. I'm thinking of the love of God manifest in this sacrifice of energy and effort that doesn't purchase anything for me in a transactional sense, which is a theology that came up in the 11 and 1200s, when much of life was very transactional and it was a metaphor that made sense. And so Bibles of that time, pastors of that time were translating and preaching in ways that would reflect the feudal system of barter and trade and how somebody could be redeemed in that sense. And that got into our language, but that is not.
It's difficult when, as Christians, we think of Christ's blood and forgiveness. And then you read something like this, and you're talking about being condemned.
Well, the word condemned is also often translated as judged, and that's different. And it's often translated interchangeably depending on what they're saying. Judged implies possibilities for turning away. Here it seems like the die is cast, it is the end. And what is being described here is a final reaping of the human race to give assurance to Christians that there is a finitude to the suffering that we will endure. This is not an annihilation. This is a harvest. This is a reclamation of what is good growing in between the weeds on this planet. This is literally beating our weapons into plowshares. Take that too. Like that's, and what will be reaped will be our weapons of war. And the aspects of our existence that continue to magnify the suffering and turn people away from the God of love. So this imagery, I think, is more a victim of its time than it is of what it's trying to communicate in the underlying point. When people read that, they read of blood poured out and spanning the course of miles, and people seem to relish in that description, as if the blood wasn't the wrath of, wasn't the all of the nastiness, and the wine is not meant to be consumed, but dispersed and removed, poured out, and is poured out over to push. John has it in his mind, poured out over all of them that made it, who wouldn't give it up, who would not give up the violence and the greed and the power. My personal hope is for a God that I mentioned, that part where it doesn't say after the harvest whether or not there's a separating of the wheat and the chaff, and some want to see in that a universal salvation where everyone is gathered up. I hope for that. There are moments in the Bible that allude to something like that, and then there are other moments that are very clear, like much of Revelation is, or Matthew, sheep, goats. Like
even in the millennium. In the millennium, there are going to be those that don't believe when Christ is right there to lead them. There'll be still rebellious people.
I cannot wait to talk about the millennium with you, because I don't know what I think of it yet. I don't have a formed opinion of its meaning. So,
well, it's all in the future, and All I have
Well,
is my little tiny brain reading the words and with not much background. But I did think when it said this, I couldn't help but think about the Holocaust and how the
mm,
millions, the 6 million, I believe, Jews were killed in the Holocaust. And it just,
does this have
it,
resonance with Hitler burned out in a bunker? You know,
yeah, you,
he died in.
you, you feel for those souls. You know,
Mhm.
they lost their lives, and now these people are going to lose their lives because um, they're not willing to have a relationship with the Lord.
I
That
believe.
Satan has just possessed them.
Here's what I believe. This is your pastor's theology, and I know it's not fully yours, Sue, but you are also a person I respect, and you are gracious and full of love for everyone around you. I want to acknowledge both of those things. But I hope, it's a hope, and I will name it as that God is, I believe that God will restore and redeem, save, if you will, everything that can be within the bounds of free will. And what happens when you set a created order off to do its own things and cut its own grooves? It's going to be messy. And I believe that God can redeem all that is possible. I hope for all of it. I hope for all of it. I hope that when I read a passage like this, it's a redeeming fire. It says the smoke goes up forever and ever, and that to emphasize the finality, the end to the suffering. It's over. It's done. Forget it.
Yeah.
Smoldering remnant forever and ever. That's Babylon. That's the rubble. That's what we hope for too, right? And the people who first read this believed that was just around the corner. Rome did not fall like it. It fell.
Yeah.
It was. There were moments where it probably seemed as grandiose as the Book of Revelation, but a lot of it was a slow, steady decline. But the point still carries: all empires fall. None of the nation states we put our trust and faith in, however we value patriotism, none of those allegiances will last finally. And my hope is, if you can imagine a nation state that deserved what's described here, and there have probably been moments in all of our lives where we've thought that, maybe not a nation state, but like when you think of Nazis generally, or you think of just the worst players in human history, there are times where you think, yeah, that is what you deserve. That uppercut in the hero action movie where it just feels like, while that makes sense, and I believe is reflected in this passage and is pastoral in that sense, I think in a way, if I'm reading that in the context of the Roman Empire, it's going to give me courage. Your day's coming, your comeuppance is coming. At the same time, I feel a little bit like I do about like Psalm 23, where what makes the meal pleasant is the presence of the enemies. It's kind of a gloating. It's like what makes this meal sweeter is that they're watching. I think that even those feelings, when we know God best, will go by the wayside.
Is it Lazarus and the old man that went to paradise and he wanted him to send a cup of water over, and he said no.
Lazarus and the rich man who'd built the silo.
Yeah, and I did, that made me think of that because if they're sitting there and looking at it, wishing they could be with you or where you are at that time, then maybe some other people might come up with the same idea.
There's two ways of seeing it. In Revelation and the Psalm 23 gives us room for both. Although I think you could see it as what I described, vindictive, sort of sitting off there, like, boy, these chicken nuggets taste so much better because my enemy's over there watching me eat it in their face, Or you could see it as, I hate that love burns you like fire. I wish you could understand love and know that that's, when I talk to people who think that I'm against them, and I'm not. I swear I'm not. I swear I love them. And they receive my overtures from the vantage point of me being an enemy sometimes. And I'm not because I'm saying I wear Jesus on my sleeve and I'm real churchy and stuff. I just mean there are people I know who I intend nothing but goodwill. And they don't receive it that way. for various reasons. And I could see maybe you could interpret it in that sense where the when I alluded to that too, where the smoke that is pleasant to the saints is torturous to those that threw the saints in ovens, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, if Hitler, I mean, again, when you bring, people say it's true. When by the time you brought up the Nazis, the conversation has run its course because it's just the easiest way of, you know, finding the penultimate bad guys. But it's all conjecture. But you can at least understand conceptually this idea that maybe so a victim of the Holocaust, in an attempt to connect and forgive, which I would never be in my place to demand anyone to do that in that circumstance. But should they find themselves in a place to do that, you could see people who had participated in their suffering receiving it very poorly if they weren't ready to receive that love, or if they were still doubling down on the violence that they had caused, as many did after the Second World War.
Mhm. If you think you're doing right, then you don't regret what you've done.
Yes. Yes. And that's painful when you come up against somebody who it seems fairly clear to you.
Mhm. Yeah.
It's most frustrating. I guess it's not most frustrating. I was about to say it's most frustrating when they're trying to see it and can't. But I guess as I was saying that, I'm thinking of times where I can tell people are putting in effort, and that does make sense. But
Yep.
well, Laura, this is your first time in like a recorded session. I don't know what you've watched outside, but what I do is if I catch anybody picking their nose or doing something off, you know, like when occasionally I cut all that out, whatever anyone watches later. And if the conversation meanders into things that aren't on to the point, or more about the life in our congregation, maybe relevant to the point, but more of an inside house conversation between people who know one another. You saw a little bit of that with Sue and I. We know some of our differences, but this is a place we can have those conversations, and that's.
Well, that's what the church is all about. We need to share.
I am learning. I am discovering this
with one another and accept the person. They're in the church because they love the Lord. Now, we love the Lord in different ways. So we have to accept the way that people love the Lord their way, even if it's not our way. So we just, you know, we call them our brothers and sisters in the Lord, and we're all big one happy family.
Yeah, this is the first church. Ours is the first church I've ever been a part of where I've been able to live into that. And it's still new to me. It's still awkward for me. I still have my guard up, and it's not your fault. I still in church circles feel it's talking about Revelation. Oh my goodness. Anxiety, you know. But this has been so going through this with you here, the three of you here, and then those that are here in other lessons, and even making the recordings, even if it's a recording I make, and you said, Laura, more people, whatever. This has been so good for me to go through this book that had in a systematic way to teach folks in my church something that had caused me so much harm growing up.
Chapter 1, blessed is the one that reads the book.
I feel that way more so now. Although again, you know, we grappled today with some of the troubling dimensions of it, but
you know, this book, with our little minds, we're not going to understand everything. We can read what other people think about it and then draw our own conclusions. But I think we have to let the Holy Spirit speak to us as we read it, and go by what the Holy Spirit tells us is right. And then you may hear somebody else say something, and you may think, oh, I need to rethink that. So, yeah. That's why God gives us community, so we can draw from each other.
This book comes alive all around us now that it's more in my mind. So like a few days ago, my friend Mike, who you're getting, who by the way, let me know he's going to join our church. So just but my friend Mike, but he said he said to me he went to a school, a meeting down in the city county building, where it was a hearing on something that would a bill that would siphon money out of public schools more so. And it was quite contentious. And he said, I felt like I saw the belly of the beast. And he was just using a figure of speech. This is it. This is what is trying to be described by the apparatuses that seem impersonal, but pull others in. And if you bear the mark, meaning you could sit there with your relatives back in Rome and say, you've got Caesar's mark. No, I don't. Yeah, I saw you the other day selling out down the road and blah, 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 blah. Yeah,
Right.
you're wearing it right on your forehead where and we all in our own ways are compromised, and we have to determine to anyway. I'm just preaching at this point. Laura, you seem like you were about to say something.
Yeah, this has been fascinating. I had not watched anything, full disclosure. So I just came, and it's so fascinating. I took so many notes because I want to share it with Bob. He had to do something else, but, and just for myself as well, not just for, yeah, I think you got to have knowledge behind why this was written, how, and translations and all that, I think, to be able to understand. So I'm so thankful that you are sharing that, because I don't know Hebrew, and I don't understand, have that, like what you said about I forget where it was with the 11th and 12th centuries. Oh, the language of transaction would be more understandable.
And I might be off a century one way or the other, but in my church history class, Saint Anselm, that's the name I remember and associated with this theology. And it was a way of him making the gospel more relevant to a certain time, but it became part of our way of understanding.
I love learning stuff like that. It makes things make more sense to me. But just a couple things. It's Godwin's law when everything comes back to Hitler, by the way. You probably knew that.
Yeah, okay, there you go. You got it.
And this is the second time today I've heard someone reference that Silmarillion.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's odd. That is strange.
It's very odd. But it was in the context of something I was watching on YouTube that related to music. And so that's, if I had to sort of say what really affected me, there were many points that were very eye-opening tonight that you were talking about, but the whole section where it was the new song and how the people could learn that song of heaven and everything, that was really interesting to me. And I guess it really resonates with me because music is very powerful. Not just for me, but like I've worked with people for whom music was extremely powerful, and it caused huge, transformations in their lives and my own as well. So that was fascinating and interesting about the part that some people just couldn't assimilate with that, with the harmony or the music. Yeah, there was a lot. I feel like I'm rambling, but I hope that.
No, yeah, I am so for you being able to come into this lesson with there was a lot that I did not, that we talked about, not like once or twice, but throughout, that I can move quickly past in this group. But all of these, and God help you, some of the video recordings are probably more difficult to listen to than others, but it is all recorded and on our YouTube page. So, at your leisure. Yeah.
Yes.
And when we're done with going through what we did, we started out with our own revelation story, our own interactions with this book, and we shared those things. And then the next week we did apocalyptic literature in Hebrew, apocalyptic literature and like Hebrew literature that came before it, to give some context for this genre and to understand it as a genre. And then we got into the book proper and how it's like, who wrote it, its context. I think it was the fourth week before we got into actual text. So now we're on the text and we're getting through. And when we're done with the text, we're going to do one class on Revelation through the centuries to catch us up. How has this been interpreted in the roughly 1900 years or so since it was written? And then what do people think of it today? Which I think we can all form a general idea of how it's held in pop culture, but that's where we're going.
Sure.